Hey everybody, it is Mike Schumann and Seth Tow here for yet another edition of the East 17th Street podcast, a podcast by the Daily Hoosier as we continue our one opponent, one position group preview for the 2025 IU football season. And as you can see if you're watching on YouTube, we are taking a look at the UCLA Bruins, who the Hoosiers face in Week 8 on October 25th, and the Indiana defensive line. And Seth, starting with UCLA, I always go back to last year really with that game. That was a kind of defining early moment of the Kurt Signetti era, going up against a coach in Deshaun Foster, who was a first year coach like himself, and it was defining it in that aspect too. As Signetti and Indiana went on the road to the Rose Bowl, a venue he called at Big Ten Media Day last year, I believe, just an old stadium, and they treated it like one. They went out there and they kind of took over the stadium by the second half. I think a lot of IU fans out there in the building, out on the West Coast, were excited about the chance to have Indiana out there, and it was ended up being a pretty festive atmosphere for IU. 42-13, I believe, was the final, and Indiana never really looked back from that point. And so now it's kind of interesting to me. You get UCLA in a home and home before you ever face USC. Just kind of a little scheduling nuance there. But what is the state of the Bruins as they make the return trip in 2025 to Bloomington?
There's definitely going to be some pressure, I think, on the coaching staff this season because I don't think the Bruins are looking very strong this year. This is projecting to be one of the worst teams in the Big Ten, just to put it bluntly. I mean, going into last year, atmosphere aside, we thought, obviously, we didn't know everything that we now know about what Indiana was going to be last year. But going into that, I guess just with a little bit of uncertainty on both sides, we kind of thought, first road game, and maybe the teams are like similar enough entering the season that it could be kind of a toss-up. It's nowhere near that this season. I mean, Indiana is probably a top third. I think you could pretty reasonably say Indiana is going to be in the top third of the Big Ten this year. And UCLA is, I think, bottom four in the Big Ten overall. I think they brought in the quarterback, Nico. Was it? I'm Oliva. I am Avadiala. I don't know. I'm gonna butcher that every time. I'll just call him Nico.
Because of the way he left Tennessee, I'm going with I'm Oliva for sure.
yeah. I'll just go with Nico. They brought in Nico out of the portal, and I mean he's a good player, but I just don't know that he's going to have enough around him for that transfer to really make a difference.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of pressure on the coaching staff. I don't know if you or others listening saw this week. There was some buzz going around about Deshaun Foster not making his players available for media, not making his staff available for media. And that's the first thing I thought of. I was like, wow, that to me is a sign that he's feeling the pressure. Like,
right. That's definitely something you do when things are going well.
right. I mean, I got Mike Woodson vibes from it, to be honest.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. And I mean, he was, and the thing is, we never really pressed Wood. I mean, you could make the case that maybe we should have, or others should have, but I mean, Woodson was never pressed about it directly in a press conference. And like, what was going viral was Deshaun Foster, excuse me.
He went viral too.
We don't need to go there. Deshaun Foster was like asked about his decision to do that, and he was just given a lot of coach speak, being like, we need to focus in on wins, and making players available isn't gonna get us wins. And I mean, from a media perspective, obviously we'll be a little biased there, but I mean, that is just generally failing to see the big picture. And yeah, I mean, us writing articles might not necessarily help you get wins and losses, but it might help you get fans in the door. And it might, it helps with your overall brand and your image, which I feel like if you're on the hot seat a little bit, might be something you should have some interest in.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say about the fans kind of connecting to that game last year. I mean, I don't know how many people were there, but I'm guessing it was less than
Yeah.
half full. And,
I mean, all
you
the
know,
talk about the Rose Bowl last year and going into that, and like how are they going to handle the Rose Bowl? In hindsight, I feel like it was more, everybody from the Midwest at least was just kind of talking about it as, knowing the mystique of the stadium and the atmosphere that comes with the Rose Bowl game, not as much being familiar with UCLA game day atmospheres at the Rose Bowl.
right, exactly. And I think it's part of a larger trend throughout a lot of aspects of college sports, specifically on the West Coast. You see, like, panned out shots at USC, where there's not a good crowd even for a football school like that. There's talk at Cal about potentially disbanding their program because they don't have enough revenue. I mean, it's kind of wild to see, but it's part of the reality that we're in right now. And the other reality that we're in right now that I don't want to gloss over is, I guess we'll just call him Nico. That situation with how he left Tennessee, I don't want to skip over that because I think that is just a fascinating aspect of college sports right now. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding if it is that he was kind of the thought to be the starter at spring practice and basically tried to hold Tennessee hostage for more NIL money, and they kind of balked at that, and that's how we ended up at UCLA.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, just a crazy scenario. Because it, like, logically, the position, if I'm capturing that right, it makes sense. Like, you do have all the power in spring practice if you're the clear cut starter. Like, it's very hard. It would have, like, you think about Indiana with Fernando Mendoza, it would have been very hard for them after spring practice to go out and find a new starting quarterback. So it's one of the many tentacles of NIL and the transfer portal that college sports is going to have to get their arms around for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, you can also understand Tennessee's perspective and not wanting to pony up there for a guy who missed a lot of spring practice and, kind of put himself behind the eight ball in terms of working with his teammates for the next year. And not even to speak of, a guy you want in a leadership position on the team, clearly looking out for himself over the rest of the team, which, not, there's obviously both sides of it. We were just, I'm not saying that Nico is wrong to try to get those bags. But I see you see Tennessee's side of it too. That if you're trying to
Right.
win games, maybe you don't want your big outspoken leader pulling stuff like that.
Right. So that segues into the new offensive coordinator at UCLA, and he's a very familiar face. Again, for YouTube viewers, you can see him on the screen there. He is Tino Sunseri, former Indiana quarterbacks coach, had been with Kurt Signetti and Mike Shanahan for several years before taking over the offensive coordinator role. And so he'll have the opportunity or responsibility for getting Nico right, getting that offense right. It was kind of the weakness of the team last year. And, it's going to be interesting. Like, he's a guy that can share a lot of intel in terms of how everything clicks at Indiana, what makes the offense click. Don't know how much ultimate value that will have, but it's an interesting storyline. There's a few interesting storylines in this game, but that's certainly one of them. The hire itself, I thought, made a lot of sense. I mean, he's a guy that has this kind of quarterback whisperer reputation, and has, it was just seemed like a matter of time before he got an opportunity like that. Good opportunity, another Big Ten program, historic program. So it kind of made sense from both sides, and it was, good for Indiana that they didn't lose their own OC to someone, but you can't keep everyone, and I think Tino's a guy that will probably go on and do good things here.
Yeah, absolutely. It made sense. I mean, like you say, it's hard to keep everyone when you have a successful team. That's just the name of the game. And honestly, it's impressive that Indiana was able to keep as much of the staff together as they did. I mean,
Right.
only losing one coach from that staff is honestly pretty impressive. I mean, and they had to step up with the new contract for Brian Haynes to keep him around. And, Kurt Signetti did a good job as far as staff retention after the season. But yeah, I mean, Tino Sinceri was a pretty clear-cut name, even mid-season last year. If you had said who's the, if you're ignoring coordinators, I guess, if you said who's the most likely position coach on the staff to leave for a new job, you would have immediately said Sinceri. I mean, he did great work with Curtis Rourke. He had the track record of this like young rising offensive mind, quarterback whisperer, like you say. And I mean, it makes a lot of sense. UCLA looking for a jolt this year. The question remains, as I alluded to before, does he have enough to work with to kind of work his magic this year? But I mean, there's two sides of it as well. You say, he may be able to give UCLA some insight as to, what makes Indiana run. But I mean, this is a guy that Indiana is going to be familiar with themselves. And you got to figure that Tino, he's going to put his own touch on everything, but you got to figure that a lot of UCLA's offense could look kind of similar to what Indiana does offensively. So, there may be, two sides to that coin.
Yep, that's a fair point. Is there anything else about the UCLA offense, positive or negative? Who's returning, who's not, that stood out to you when you went through their profile?
Well, let's see. I mean, Nico, we talked about him. I mean, good player, obviously, and he can, bit of a dual threat quarterback as well. UCLA brought in a transfer running back from Cal, Javian Thomas, who did well last year, 100 carries, 626 yards, and 7 touchdowns. I mean, that's nothing to squawk at per se.
Right.
And they still have they still have Jalen Berger from the Michigan State transfer last year as well. So yeah, I mean, and those two with Nico, I would imagine can kind of help pick up UCLA's running game a little bit more. But they lost 3 of their 5. They lost their 3 leading receivers last year and 4 of their top 5. So there's a lot of question marks in the passing game, and the offensive line struggled mightily last year. They've got 2 back, a couple transfers that are gonna play a role there. But I mean, there's just the running game might save them from being the worst in the Big Ten by any stretch. And with somebody like Nico, who's played in the SEC, played in the big moments, won big games, gotten tasted the college football playoff. Obviously, the playoff didn't really go well for Tennessee, but he knows what it takes to get there. There is something to be said for having a guy like that, leading your offense. But the question just will remain, does he have enough around him to kind of make it all work? And let's just say I'm not convinced.
Right. Yeah, and obviously, Tino's a good coach and he's well respected, but he was only part of the equation. Curt Cignetti was heavily involved in Indiana's offense, and obviously Mike Shanahan, the offensive coordinator. So, now Tino is on his own with a new head coach, and we'll see how it goes. But
to be clear, also this year with UCLA, like whether it goes, like even if it goes poorly for UCLA's offense, that shouldn't really be reflected on Tino, because it's it's a job he need to take, stepping up to offensive coordinator and getting play calling duties. Like it's a job that no question you have to take if you're Tino, but it may not be his fault, let's say, if UCLA's offense is not very good this season.
Yeah, and if it's not very good, it's probably going to be a problem, because the defense was the better unit on the team last year, and according to Bill Connolly's returning production numbers, they only returned 37% of that defense, which is 114th in the country. So darn near the bottom of everyone in returning production. There is another Indiana storyline. It might be fair to say no team in the country is going to have more quote unquote intel on what Indiana's trying to do on both sides of the ball than UCLA, because last year's starting cornerback Jameer Johnson will be a cornerback on this UCLA team, Pasadena native. So he is returning home for his final year of college football. So that's an interesting story in and of itself. But what else do you see on this UCLA defense?
Yeah, I mean, it's very notable how much they lost defensively. I mean, it's really crazy. they have the lowest amount of returning production defensively in the entire Big Ten. They lost 2 all Big Ten caliber linebackers last season. They were pretty good up the middle, in the middle of the defensive linebacker, and it's just not really clear like who they're going to have stepping into these roles. And Jameer Johnson is on the roster, but I'm not sure how much he's really going to play. It looks like he's maybe a little buried on the depth chart there, at least per Our Lads, which maybe I guess we'll see on that. But yeah, they lost so much from the defense that was pretty solid. It's hard to know what this unit is going to be. I mean, the list of like what they lost that was notable compared to the list of notable pieces they added, it's just there's a big size differential. The number of pieces they added that looked impressive or notable when I was going through putting the preview together, it was just kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel a little bit. It felt like trying to the most notable guy I could find that they added, it seemed like, was a linebacker defensive back, Ben Perry, out of who was reserve at Louisville last year and had 2.5 TFLs and 1 sack. And it's like, the stats aren't always everything, when you talk about guys, but it just didn't seem like they brought in the type of pieces they were going to need to sustain that defensive production.
Right. So UCLA's right around 52nd, 51st in ESPN's FPI SB Plus. So kind of a middle of the road team nationally. We'll see how it goes. That's week 8, October 25th in Bloomington. Obviously, a lot can transpire between now and then, but at the moment, that looks like a very winnable game for Indiana. And let's pivot to the defensive line of Indiana as we go to the second segment of the episode. And, going into last year, I spent a lot of time at fall camp paying attention to the defensive line because I just felt like it's always like kind of a unit that kind of makes or breaks a team. And especially in the Big Ten, you got to have a very aggressive and dominant and physical D-line. And I thought I started to see the makings of that, and it played out. But they've lost some key components to that this year. The headliners, of course, are CJ West, who is now with the San Francisco 49ers, drafted in the 4th round, and James Carpenter, who is at the Jacksonville Jaguars training camp, fighting for a roster or practice squad spot. But returning is also a headliner in Mikhail Kamara out on the edge. Led all of FBS in QB pressures last year. And they've got some other interesting pieces coming in from the transfer portal and returning. Tyreek Tucker, I think, is a potentially breakout star this year, and I think Hosea Wheeler might be the other one that can really come in. He's a transfer from Western Kentucky and do big things. So I think there's the potential there to pick up where they left off. But what's your kind of overall big picture impression of where the IU defensive line is this year compared to last year?
Compared to last year, I feel better about the depth of the defensive line. I think the depth going into last season, I think we felt like, Kamara looked like a potential game wrecker, and there was a lot of high potential, when you looked at James Carpenter and CJ West up the middle. But there were just so many question marks about what they had behind them. And defensive line is one of those groups where, you may list some starters, but that might not mean all that much because you're going to rotate pretty heavily throughout the game, especially up the middle at defensive tackle. Like you just need to be able to rotate through, and you need to have more than 2 guys. You got to have 3 or 4 guys that, at least with the way Indiana plays, you got to be able to, the depth is so important. I feel better about the depth coming into this season than I did last season for Indiana on the defensive line. And a lot of that, honestly, is because of Tyreek Tucker, I think, because Tyreek Tucker last year was kind of, he wasn't really in the mix for a starting job. it didn't seem like in fall camp, but it felt like every time that he got an opportunity, he was making plays out there on the field. Like he graded pretty well, I recall, on PFF last year. And, it was on a limited sample size, obviously, because he was in a reserve role behind two really strong defensive tackles. But it felt like every time he had an opportunity, Tyreek Tucker was making some plays. And yeah, like we'll have to see if he's able to sustain it in a bigger role this year. But I think getting that question mark out of the way and being able to kind of open up everything else, I think Tyreek Tucker is what, is maybe the biggest key on the defensive line as a whole, because you shouldn't have too many questions about Mikal Kamara. I like a lot of the versatility you have in some of these guys. Kellen Wyatt has gotten a lot of rave reviews throughout fall camp, and he's a guy that feels like, he's like almost a perfect fit for the stud position where, kind of a hybrid linebacker, defensive end, but like it feels like you could move him around to a bunch of spots. Mario Landino in reserve, you could probably move him inside or outside. Like there's a lot of versatility on the defensive line that I don't know that we saw, or at least that we knew about going into last season. So I guess that's the biggest thing that I see on the defensive line is the versatility.
Yeah, and to that point, talking about Kamara, there's been a lot made about him, quote unquote, changing positions this year, which I've always found to be a little bit of a strange concept, because if you tell me somebody led the nation in pressures, I'm thinking I'm not going to do anything to change what he was doing, because he's pretty darn good at it. And it's kind of led me to this view that I'm curious about. I don't really think he's quote unquote changing positions. I think they're just going to move him all over the field and try to put him in the most advantageous spots to create the most havoc on every snap. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's probably fair to say. If they're going to call him at the stud position, and some of it may also depend on, I guess, the way we saw, knowing that they were moving him to the stud, we projected the depth chart to have Stephen Daly starting at the other defensive end spot. But, there's especially given all the level of hype that we've seen around Kellen Wyatt, maybe it makes more sense to, you can call it whatever you want, but, maybe it would still be Kamara in that defensive end role, and they're just going to move him around wherever they're, able, whatever is most advantageous for them. Because Wyatt is kind of a perfect fit. He was playing kind of like linebacker, defensive end, like, a little bit of both in that role at Maryland. So, he feels like a perfect fit for what they would want in the actual stud position. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's what ends up happening, and maybe it's, the position names are just position names, and maybe they'll be playing some positionless defensive line, so to speak.
Right. You joke, but I kind of think that's the way things are moving. It's all about matchups, and it's all about kind of deception at the line of scrimmage to get, guys in the spots you want them to be. But I do agree with you completely. I think Wyatt is the one that's kind of trending towards being the bookend opposite Kamara in whatever formation that they're in, probably with Tucker and Wheeler lining up on the inside. But you're right again that defensive tackle, Indiana as a whole didn't really rotate a whole lot last year as a team, but it was defensive tackle where they did. I even remember we were talking early in the season, like, CJ West, just, he's not getting a lot of snaps, he doesn't really seem like he's making a big impact, and then by the second half of the season he was dominating. So I think there'll be a lot to play out here, and things could evolve over the course of the season. I think, you mentioned Stephen Daly. I find him interesting. Like he's coming in very much under the radar, and I think he's kind of a tweener at 270-ish pounds. So I think he could be used in a lot of different ways as well. So I think this is an interesting group, and I think it has a lot of potential. I was pretty fascinated, by the way, listening to Zen Mikowski yesterday talking about Kamara. Just somebody asked him for his assessment of Kamara, and he basically said he's just never seen anybody like him. And I for a guy that's played for 4 years at Ohio State, I thought that was a pretty interesting commentary. And maybe what makes Kamara so unique is that just guys don't know how to deal with him, because he's relatively short, but he's got an incredibly fast twitch to his game, and highly skilled in terms of his technique. So I thought that was pretty interesting too.
Yeah. And I mean, the big question with Kamara really for this year, it's not the position change or whatever they're going to do with him this year. To me, it's last year. I mean, he's not the only one you could make this point about, but last year coming in from JMU, he probably was not at least at the top of the scouting report, at least at the beginning of the season. I'm sure that by the Ohio State game, everybody was well aware of Mikhail Kamara, but especially early in Big Ten season, I mean, there were probably still some, he was probably still a little unknown. Guys didn't, the spotlight wasn't fully on him. I mean, but to make that point this year, I mean, there's no hiding. I mean, he's, was an All-American type last year, all Big Ten. Like the spotlight is going to be on him, that he is going to be at the top of the scouting report for, opposing offenses, opposing offensive lines in terms of just, we need to stop this guy and make sure that he is not blowing us up every play. And the question is, how is he going to handle potentially increased attention on the offensive line? Is he going to be able to just make it irrelevant and continue making a huge impact? Do his numbers dip? Is he going to be the type that is able to eat up two offensive linemen or, offensive line and a running back, in terms of blocking him and free up a teammate? I'm curious to see what the evolution is for Mikhail Kamara this year with potentially increased attention from him from opposing offensive lines.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've seen this scenario in different contexts, and like to the point where it wouldn't be surprising if his production slipped off a little bit this year, not because he's doing anything wrong, but just because, like you're saying, all the attention. And I got to believe that was maybe part of the pitch and the appeal to guys like Wyatt, guys like Daly, that look, you're going to come in opposite this guy. Since you like to go with Ravens references all the time, I'll give you a Steelers reference, like going opposite TJ Watt.
Yeah.
On the edge like that's you're going to put up big numbers just because there's so much attention on the other side, and you can only double team one guy or throw the running back and chip one guy. So I think that could be part of what's going on here, and how they were able to get some pretty appealing guys like Daly and White in the mix as well.
Yeah, and I mentioned Landino before, but that's a name to keep an eye on as well. He looked like he was ready in the limited action he played last year. He, continues to, he hasn't shown anything in fall camp suggesting that he's regressed. I think with the versatility that I mentioned with him specifically before, I think he's a really useful piece to watch on the defensive line this year.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, definitely noticed his motor last year and seems to be trending favorably. I wouldn't doubt it, or wouldn't be surprised if he was like on the second unit in the rotation. I think his classmate Daniel Ndukwe is another guy that's intriguing, very athletic, very long. Made some
He's
plays
a big dude.
yeah, made some plays in. I think he blocked 2 punts last year, if I'm remembering correctly. So just a guy that can make an impact with his length and athleticism. That I wouldn't be surprised if he finds his way into the mix, especially in the early games this year. We haven't mentioned Dominic Ratcliffe, Texas State transfer, also in the mix at defensive tackle.
Speaking of big dudes.
Yeah, and who was it? Also Mikowski yesterday. Somebody recently I heard say that he was like the twitchiest guy, or maybe the quickest guy along the offensive line. Might have been Wheeler that said that. So goes back to your original point. I really do believe there is depth here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that depth is probably the reason why some of these, they do have 4 true freshmen. Do they have 5 true freshmen? They might have 5 total true freshmen on this roster. Going to be pretty hard for them to break through. I'm talking about Kyler Garcia, Jarevius Hall. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing his name. Keyshawn Calhoun, Tristan Abram, and Tyrone Burris. Hall, interestingly enough, is the heaviest player on the team. I was looking at this the other day. I think he was around 310 as a freshman, as a true freshman. He did come in early, so had a chance to put on some mass, but you don't typically see that. I don't know if that necessarily means he's physically ready to play, but from just a size standpoint, he's a big dude.
Yeah, I mean, not to get too into the weeds as far as the health and diet aspect, but especially for a true freshman to come in with that amount of weight, I think it's a reasonable question to ask how much of that is good weight versus bad weight.
Yep, absolutely. Fair point. Not sure that there's anybody we're missing here. Anything else about this group? I will say also add there was a position change into the group, which is another interesting thing to me. Quentin Clark was recruited as a linebacker, and now probably more along the lines of that stud position. He's up to 227 pounds, so undersized defensive lineman, but very athletic. So probably in the hybrid role, more trending towards playing outside linebacker, going dropping back in coverage, things of that nature. But he did make the change and did put on about 15 pounds. So he's another guy that will be interesting to see how this year goes for him. But it could be a transition year as he learns a new role.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can lump him in with so many of these other redshirt freshmen that we haven't, we just haven't gotten the biggest chance to see yet, just because they didn't see the field really last year, and because of that, you can only take so much away from what you see in practice, and not that it doesn't count, but
Right.
you can only take so much away from that, and a lot of what you'd say about him. And, it's not just even defensively, offensively, skill positions, like everywhere. There's just a lot of redshirt freshmen, it feels like, on this team who I think this is kind of a potential show me year for some of these guys, as far as they may not need to be immediate contributors this year, but it feels like the type of year for some of those guys where they at least show it to the coaching staff whether they're potential pieces for the team's future, or whether they may end up needing to go elsewhere to see the field more in the future.
Yep. Yep. I think, both on both sides of the ball in the trenches, I hope we get some wide margins in these first few games, because I would just like to see, like, who's on the three deep, who can make a impact as they go deeper and deeper into the roster. Because to the point of depth, I mean, there's just so many players along the offensive and defensive line that we've really never had to see play meaningful snaps. So it'll be interesting to see who emerges into those roles this year.
Yeah, no doubt. And as you said at the top, I mean, games are won and lost, not just defensive lines. At this level, it's all in the trenches. Games are won and lost in the trenches, offensive line, defensive line, and I mean, we talked about offensive line last episode. So, I mean, at least just with the defensive line, I think there's a lot to feel good about for Indiana this year at that position, which is a really important group.
Yep. And I think we can leave it right there for this edition of One Opponent, One Position Group. We'll pick it up again very soon with Maryland. That will be a trip back out on the road after a few weeks at home, and then also to the linebacker group, which I think I'm as interested in watching the linebackers as any other position group on the field. So we can talk a little bit about why that is when we pick this up next time. He is Seth Tow. I am Mike Schumann for East 17th Street and the Daily Hoosier. We will catch you all next time.